Open with a prayer because it may catch up with us and I may not have time at the end and may cut me off, but let's just start with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for this opportunity for us to join together this morning in a new and innovative way. Thank you for this beautiful, gorgeous weather today, and hopefully it'll give us an opportunity to get outside and enjoy your creation. Thank you for being with us through this entire pandemic episode, and we look forward to our church family getting back together for real, hopefully not too distant future. Thank you for all of our blessings. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so we've been kind of going through this book in fits and starts, but as luck would have it, yesterday I ran into an article in the Washington Post, and it's by a guy named Steve Hendricks, who apparently is their Jerusalem bureau chief. But the title of the article says, "In Jerusalem, coronavirus battle builds bridges." And if you think about back to about 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the establishment of Israel as a state and the battle over some of the lands and the kind of booting out the Arabs that were already living there, and this contention that has been present, all along, and the fact that really hasn't gotten better over the last 60 years. Today's chapter, we get into chapter 4. It talks about the 1967 war, where the Israelis took a lot of these lands back, annexed a lot of territory that had been Palestinian, and how there's just this constant struggle between these religious Zionists, which we're going to talk about, and Palestinians over these occupied lands. But the point of this article is, it starts out, it says, when Jesse Michael Kramer was hospitalized with coronavirus in Jerusalem, he realized as soon as the doctor in the spacesuit introduced himself that it would be a rare encounter. Kramer is an Israeli ultra-Orthodox Jew, and Fadi Karuf is a Palestinian Muslim. So here you have in the hospitals, you have innumerable situations where we have a real clash of theology, but they said nobody has objected to if you're Arab, nobody has objected to an Israeli doctor or vice versa. And he talks about how the Muslim doctors have learned some Hebrew, and how unfortunately heard the death prayer so many times that they've actually learned that, and how that there's amongst the staff they have Israeli nurses working right alongside of Muslim nurses and doctors as well. And he concludes the article by saying, this is from a nurse. She says, "I do believe that if we at Hadassah, that's the hospital, were the politicians, we could have peace." She says she now has enough command of Judaism to become a rabbi. She and Jewish colleague Julie Ben-Benishti have sought to share some of what they call healthcare diplomacy through an organization called Nurses in the Middle East. As to whether the good feelings will endure once the crisis is over, Ben-Benishti has her doubts. For a research paper, she once surveyed dozens of ultra-Orthodox patients to see whether their experience in the hospital had changed their view of the Arab-Jewish schism once they got out. The answer was largely no.
Can you see if you can let Maggie in? It says it's waiting for you to let her in.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm running my mouth. But so anyway, so the attitudes of these people didn't change after their hospitalization. But this nurse says that they said the hospital was a very special place where everyone got equal care. But on the outside, that still wasn't the case. So we've got some medical people here in our group. I just found that fascinating, and a glimmer of hope, I guess, in the midst of all this. But I thought that was pretty interesting, based on the stuff that we've been talking about. There it is. We're in the real world, and just kind of another wrinkle to this whole coronavirus story. Anybody have any thoughts about that? Bev, you've been in hospitals, and Karen?
Tom, I don't know if you can hear me, but
yeah.
it's very similar.
to kind of like all the different nationalities, whether it be black, brown, whatever. We took care of everybody alike. And yet once we left, we weren't friendly usually, except with our own group, not purposefully against them, but it's kind of the world stays divided.
I think in the late 60s, early 70s, when I first graduated, it may have been a little bit different because it was strange to see an Indian doctor or whatever, but now it's just so more common. It's great.
Yeah, it's the globalization business. We talked about that very first week. Hi, Maggie. We got you in here.
Yay!
Welcome. Yay. I was just reading an article from the Post about the coronavirus in Jerusalem and the fact that these ultra-Orthodox Jews, and they get in the hospital and they're sick as could be, and they have Palestinian Muslim doctors and nurses, and how this is not a problem in the hospital, but they apparently had done studies previously, and patients' attitudes don't change once they're out of the hospital. But it's just kind of interesting, since we're talking about this area and this very conflict, that article popped up yesterday in the Washington Post.
Well, thank you for bringing me up to date. I'm sorry for
No, it's okay. It's good.
I don't know what went wrong.
That's all right. So anyway, so I sent out a couple questions, but they kind of come up as we talk about some of this stuff. I'm really not going to, since we're kind of limited on time, I'm not going to really review what we've done over the last 3 weeks, unless anybody really wants to talk about some of those issues. They will come up as we talk about some of this other business. But last week we were in the middle of the third chapter, which starts out with a discussion of the Crusades. And I think we pretty much finished that section on the Crusades, except to remember that the Arab or Muslim view of the Crusades is very much different from those of us that learned the Western Civ classes in 9th grade or in college or whatever. It's just, it's a different perspective. And that becomes important when we talk about the current situation with jihadism and war on terror. But he finishes that chapter 3, talking about the zealots, which I'll be honest with you, I was not too familiar with until I read, I want to do it, another one of Aslan's books. Let's see if I can hold this up. Can you see that? But this is there we go.
There we go.
My right, left. But anyway, it's another book by Reza Aslan called Zealot. But it's about the life and times of Jesus. And in this chapter, in this book that we're reading, he talks about how these zealots lived right about the time of Jesus and up to the 70 or so after Jesus. And they were concentrated in the area around Galilee. And in that book, he said, well, in this book that we're reading, he mentions that a few of the zealots were pacifists and preached getting along, but the majority of these zealots were very militant and violent and preached overthrow of the Romans. And it really, he says it follows this biblical doctrine of zeal, which he calls zeal is an unwavering commitment to God's rule and uncompromising fidelity to God's law and a complete separation of God's people from their neighbors. So, when we studied Genesis and really Exodus, that sort of Israel, the Jewish people as selected by God and chosen people, and us versus them, that whole attitude was pretty strong through that book. But the zeal, carries it a couple of steps further. And he goes on to tell the story of Phineas, who if I knew the story of Phineas, I'd forgotten it a long time ago, but this is in the book of Numbers. But he was a grandson of Aaron, and it wasn't part of the culture to mix with other tribes, and so Phineas actually took it upon himself. There was a Jewish man that was living with a Moabite woman, and Phineas took it upon himself to go out and kill this man, and feeling that he was following what God wanted him to do. And in the book of Numbers, Phineas was rewarded by God for his zeal with a covenant of peace, which is kind of interesting. He goes out and slays this guy, and the book of Numbers is fairly graphic. How this occurred. Won't go into those details on Sunday morning, but anyway, Aslan goes on to say that Phineas' example of spontaneous individual action as an expression of God's jealous anger and as an atonement for the sins of the Jewish nation became the model of personal righteousness in the Bible. And he then goes on to tell a couple more stories from 1st and 2nd Kings about Elijah slaughtering all the priests of the pagan god Baal, and in the book of Kings he says he does this because he's zealous for the Lord. So that word zeal again. And in 2nd Kings there's a king Jehu who massacred all the inhabitants of Samaria, and again he did that to demonstrate his zeal for the Lord. And this zeal fits right into what Aslan was talking about in the last chapter about this collective identity, how you identify yourself, and that collective identity calling for a collective call to action. And he says that very often leads to violence, and with the justification that you're following the Lord's direction. He says the Bible's zealous heroes become a sanction for violence. And the zealot story sort of ends from 66 to 69, where there's a man named Judas the Galilean who leads a military revolt against Rome, and they throw the Romans out of the Middle East, and they of course come back in great fury and recapture Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and a few of these zealots escaped and retreated to this place called Masad or Masada, depending on where you read it. And they and I sent out a little video clip of that. I don't know if anybody watched that, but it's apparently, has anybody been there?
I've been there.
Who?
Went down a tour there when I was in the Navy ship. It's unbelievable. You can see the whole West Bank, Sea of Galilee, most of the Dead Sea. Beautiful.
So yeah, so apparently the video that I watched there showed it was pretty impressive place, and I don't how you really have to be determined to get up there. And apparently it was a palace that was built by Herod the Great, same Herod that built the temple in Jerusalem. But anyway, they escaped there, and the Romans eventually surrounded the area and built these huge ramps. And there was another video about it from the History Channel about how that occurred. But apparently they built these huge ramps where they could then siege and go up these ramps and attack this fort. And then when they got up there, everybody was dead. And they had the question of whether they all committed suicide rather than surrender, or whether or what happened. Nobody's quite sure. There's only one historical account of that, and that was that they committed suicide rather than surrender to the Romans, which is sort of the ultimate zealous reaction, I guess. And apparently, even until today, Israeli soldiers, when they're inducted into the army, they go to that location and take their oath or whatever to enter the military. And Aslan's comment at the end of that chapter is that cosmic warriors, if you remember, you go back to that old definition of what cosmic war was from the first chapter, where it's God's on our side and everybody else is in the wrong. His final statement there is cosmic warriors do not surrender. That's exhibited by that mass suicide at Masada. Anybody have any comments about that or anything? These are all stories that I am not all that familiar with, to be honest. Not an Old Testament scholar by a long stretch.
Tom, I think the author is telling us that his side won't give up either.
Right. Well, and yeah, exactly. And I think that's why that's the point of all this is that, yeah, when we get to the jihadism, back to jihadism, they identify themselves as these cosmic warriors. They're in the right, everybody else is in the wrong, and they're not going to give up. They're not going to surrender. That was his point. But I think the other point of this is that he wants to make sure everyone realizes that this, I guess, attitude or this viewpoint is not, through history, is not peculiar just to radical Islam. That it's here we have these zealots back in the time of Jesus, and then in this next chapter we start talking about the man that assassinated Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, which is not that long ago, acting under this same worldview. I'm right, everybody else is wrong, and God wants me to go kill this man because he wants to give the land back to the Palestinians. Kind of interesting, though, to see, what is that great quote about those who are ignorant of history are bound to repeat it or whatever. But I think when you see this over and over and over again, it's such an amazing pattern. So that kind of finishes chapter 3, which we were supposed to finish last week, but that's okay. So getting into chapter 4, he starts out talking about the 6-Day War in 1967. Let me just read a brief. I was in high school then, so let me just read this really brief paragraph about the 6-Day War, which I got from the History Channel. It says the 6-Day War was a brief but bloody conflict fought in June of 1967 between Israel and the Arab states of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The following years of diplomatic friction and skirmishes between Israel and its neighbors, basically the Palestinians, Israeli defense forces launched preemptive airstrikes that crippled the air forces of Egypt and its allies. Israel then staged a successful ground offensive and seized the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The brief war ended with a UN-brokered ceasefire and a significantly altered map of the Middle East, and gave rise to lingering geopolitical friction, which continues even until today. So that was a 6-day war. I don't really remember that, but just reading about it, apparently the Israelis they took out 90% of the Egyptian Air Force in one strike. It sounded like Pearl Harbor. They caught them all on the ground and just basically destroyed any air support. And then of course their ground troops were, didn't have to worry about airplanes coming in after them. But the purpose of it was to secure those lands that had been were controlled by Arabs and Muslims. And Aslan goes on in the book and says that this war, this 1967 war, took on the cosmic tones of good versus evil. And this is a direct quote from the book. With the victory of 1967 and the occupation of Palestinian lands, secular Zionism, once anathema to Orthodox Jews, was gradually being framed as merely a transient stage in God's master plan for the Jewish people, a precursor to the reestablishment of the kingdom of David. So this idea that Israel is a placeholder for the eventual return, for the Jewish people, for the coming of the Messiah, and for when we talk a little bit more later about Christian Zionists, if you will, but the return of the Messiah, that this is being seen as a cosmic war, as a cosmic conflict, that God wants us to do this because we need to rebuild the temple so we have the place for the Messiah to return, or for the Jewish folks for the Messiah to come in the first place. So it's just kind of interesting. Here it is, 1967. It's almost 2,000 years later. This whole zealotry and all this is coming back in spades. I lost my notes here. Anybody have any comments about that? I don't remember this 1967 war, except I remember it was quick, and I don't remember the politics of it at all. Apparently, Lyndon Johnson was president and sort of threatened to do a bunch of stuff and didn't do any of it, and that's why the Israelis just kind of jumped in. America kind of stayed out of it. Is that the way
I was
everybody?
in the eighth grade in high school. I probably didn't care about it.
Yeah, I was too busy listening to the Beatles.
I was working 24/7.
So anyway, so at 67, and actually, apparently I read something where there was even some discussion about, with something Obama did where they, this whole business of a two-state, a Palestinian state and Israeli state, basically in the same territory, has gone back and forth and back and forth, and Obama administration just kind of threw it back in the laps of the UN and the locals, and I guess the Trump administration is kind of taking more of a pro-Zionist approach. So again, we had these, remember we talking about the establishment of Israel was this nationalist Zionist, this sort of less religion, and then we have these religious Zionists coming back, and this, recognizing the 67 war as a cosmic war. And so these religious Zionists that kind of picked up speed here after the 67 war, they insist on a state governed wholly by religious law, one in which the land is cleansed of its foreign inhabitants so as to hasten the return of the Messiah. Religious Zionists, this is all in Aslan's book, would prefer civil war in Israel to peace with the Palestinians. So they'd rather have fights amongst themselves than have peace with the Palestinians. And the divine mission of these religious Zionists is to ensure that the occupied territories are permanently annexed to the state of Israel, and that not 1 inch of God's promised land will ever return to the Palestinians. He then goes on to discuss this man named Yigal Amir, who was one of these radical religious Zionists in Israel, who took it upon himself to assassinate Yitzhak Rabin. And Yitzhak Rabin was the prime minister. And I found a video about him that I didn't send. I found it after I sent out that email, but I'll send it out with the next email. But it's a real interesting little 20-minute blurb about him. But he was very much of a military hero going back to the 1940s, and he was instrumental in the Israeli defense minister, and he was also involved with their intelligence community, and then was prime minister twice, once in the 1970s, and then apparently when he was in the United States as a diplomat, he opened some bank accounts in D.C. and in American banks, and that was not apparently legal in Israel. So there was a scandal involved, and he resigned and was not in public service for a number of years, and then worked his way back and eventually became prime minister again. And in the 90s, he signed the Oslo Peace Accords, which began a process of returning these lands to the Palestinians. And so this fella, Yigal Amir, who was one of these radical religious Zionists, if you remember all those things I just read, he felt like that Yitzhak Rabin was being traitorous to the Jewish people, and took it upon himself to assassinate him. And he says that he acted alone, and his direct quote from this man Amir was, "He acted alone and without guidance from anyone except God." So Aslan goes back and compares this fella to Phineas, the fellow from the Book of Numbers, who took it upon himself to go out and slay this man who was living with a Moabite woman. Is that a stretch, or is that?
Sure.
And again, I guess we were busy raising kids in 1995. I just vaguely remember this assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. I don't know that I remembered all these details about it at all. But anyway, so Aslan goes on and says that Amir saw Rabin as an enemy. And remember, a couple of chapters ago, we discussed about the formation of this collective identity. One of the important aspects of that is identifying an other, or identifying who is your enemy. And so here he's identified him as an other, as an enemy, because he was willing to cede land back to the Palestinians, who was the big other, the big enemy. So we got 10 more minutes, it says here. Okay. And you know, this wasn't in his book, but it's basically the same as the way these jihadists recognize or have identified anybody that's not them as the other and their enemy. And we go back to 9/11 and the fact that they weren't really attacking the United States or any religious group. They just were attacking anybody and everybody that wasn't them. That they were the unholy. I mean, it's important to remember all this stuff because at the end of this book we start talking about Christian fundamentalism too, and a lot of these concepts come right back up. So the first half of this chapter, I'm going to stop here and see if we can't get some discussion going, because the next part of this chapter goes into the American support of the religious Zionists in Israel and then going back and talking about religious fundamentalism in the United States. I don't think we want to start that right now. But so the end of the last chapter, beginning of this chapter, he's kind of talked about zealots and people taking it upon themselves to be violent in reaction to their collective identity. He compares this assassin of Yitzhak Rabin with the biblical story of Phineas, the grandson of Aaron, and this will lead to a discussion of American Christian fundamentalism and evangelicalism, which is the next part of this chapter. Any thoughts about all this stuff? Jim, you're getting the book out, so you must have something to say.
Yeah, I've read the book, and he at least added Osama bin Laden, but he also did a pretty good job, but he still said this is a hero. He's only reacting to what has been forced upon them, and that's fine. But what about what happened years ago? The Muslim community was not immune from guilt of carrying the whole thing forward. So I think he's done a pretty good job of balance, but yet you have to understand where he comes from. What I'd like to read is a Christian review of this, a little more steady than I'm able to hear.
Yeah, it is important, and I think I probably should start each class with that. This is a Muslim right. We talked about. I mean, I sent that question out where he basically, he's talked about the Bible, but all he's talked about is all these ultra violent sections from the Bible. And I was talking to my son this week, and I said, "Do you think he's doing that on purpose? Because so many people." Cherry pick out of the Quran and say, well, this is what these people just want to cut people's heads off and, this, that, and the other. And so they've taken certain selections out of the Quran to support that. I said, is he doing this just to elicit a reaction, here's what you guys did to the Quran. I'm going to do this to your Bible. And Tommy said, knowing the guy, he would not, he would figure that would be his purpose. Would be to, just to say, well, this is what you guys have done to my book. I'm going to do this to your book. He doesn't say that, but Tom, my son, agreed that was probably the motive for writing this in this way. But I think the purpose of telling these stories is to show just how this religious extremism it didn't end with the Crusades. That obviously Osama bin Laden, and he gets into some of the writings of Osama bin Laden at the end of this chapter, where he talks about we're fighting against the crusaders. I mean, he's basically, they're still in the Middle Ages in terms of their attitude. Oh, we still got 4 minutes, so we're in good shape.
Tom, let me say, I think it is helpful for us to see another viewpoint from someone about whom I've known nothing. And what he says in his book is, yes, straightforward, and it's true, and these things did happen. But I look forward to his solutions, hopefully in the last chapter.
Right. Yeah, I have not finished the book either, but I did read the book Zealot, and we actually did that in a class up in Lynchburg. And he was very critical of the divinity of Jesus. I mean, he's a Muslim. He doesn't believe that Jesus is God, And so that, here we are reading this book in our Christian Presbyterian Sunday school class up in Lynchburg. But at the end of that book, Zealot, he says, Jesus was one of his premise is that Jesus was one of these zealots. He's one of the pacifist zealots, and he was just one of many. But at the end, he says, there's something different about Jesus than all the others, because he's the only one we still talk about 2,000 years later. So that, he does say, even though he's a non-believer, he says, there's just something different about Jesus than anybody else. And so, at least he was, at the ending of that book, thought he was very thoughtful. This book, I hope, that supposedly he's going to tell us how to fight and win these, how to solve these cosmic wars and these cosmic differences. And I don't, now that he's painted this, it just seems like it's going to be hard to take people who are so fixed in their opinions, and it's rooted in their theology. How are you going to change their minds? I think that's the tough part.
Same with us. How do you change our minds?
I think, well, hopefully my experience with Presbyterian, or at least like our brand of Presbyterian, is that we're more open-minded, more accepting, and more willing to see there's more than one way to get to God and to be saved. And that's not true for other Christian denominations, I don't think. Certainly I didn't grow up that way. I grew up in a tradition that was our way or the highway. So, I think you're right. One thing my son said about he says, this is the problem of reading a secular book in a Christian Sunday school class. Is that it, you're here to learn about your faith, and here all of a sudden we're talking about somebody else's faith, and he's challenging ours. But I do think it's valuable. We will finish this book in about 3 or 4 weeks, I would guess, unless we really get bogged down. And so I do want people to be thinking about what to do next. I don't have an agenda. I've just kind of, I think this started with Bev's suggestion of the last book was about the learning about Islam, and I think comparative religion studies are important. This book seemed to follow right in place with that one, but it's an open book. We can do whatever anybody wants to do. We can go back to doing a biblical study, or we can find more secular books to pull our hair out over. Whatever everybody wants to do.
Maybe we should do numbers.
Yeah. Yeah, Warren pretty specifically did not want to do Deuteronomy.
That's right.
But I'm glad he felt that way, actually. But
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. I know that story of Phineas looked like it could be a HBO miniseries, actually. Well, anyway, we've got a minute. Anybody have any last comments or?
Thank you, Tom. This has been very enlightening. I know more just after a couple of weeks about Islam than I've ever known in the past. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. That's the real purpose of this, I think, is to just, I know a lot more about it than I did. I'm not an expert by any stretch, and I'm learning